That's perfect.
Okay. So
Perfect storm, yeah.
So you start with a perfect storm, and the premise of it is to understand that we have a generation that is truly fundamentally different to any other generation. They wire differently. And the picture that I used, and I think makes a lot of sense, is my book is called Aliens Among Us. And the reason it's called Aliens Among Us is not to offend people, because some people will be offended, but is to say if an alien sat next to you, like, you would look at them in a different way, right? You'd be like, well, how do you communicate? What do you eat? What do you eat? And like, how do things work in your life? You take the time to make that kind of bridge, right? So what's happening with other generations is that we're looking at them as teenagers going through a phase. And like with my parents, they're like, Steve's going through a phase. When will he snap out of it? And I did, and I became like them. And every generation has, right? But here we've got with Gen Z and Alpha, a generation that is not going to snap out of it. And so the analogy that I use is every generation is blue, and you take a can of blue paint. And now what you do is you pour in some yellow paint. And that yellow paint, in essence, is what I explained to you is the perfect storm. So there's 4 components. It's technology, and I can spend an hour on each of these components. You have to, right? To truly like let it percolate. World news, social media, and parenting and leadership. Those are the 4 components that have made this generation different. And you'd be like, world news and social media sound similar. They're really not. And when you see the significance of it, it'll make more sense. So you've got this perfect storm, this yellow paint being poured into this bucket of blue paint. And as you know, when you add yellow to blue, it goes green. And so slowly from where you pour, as the center goes out, you'll start to see green, and it becomes more and more green. So that analogy is really what we're experiencing. We're seeing a generation, Gen Z, that have only ever been green. They've never been blue. So we've got the blues saying to the greens, like, why aren't you like us? But what's also happening all the time is that slowly but surely we're all becoming green, because that perfect storm has an impact on every one of our lives. It's just impacting them much more significantly and quickly because they don't have a foundation of any other color in that sense. So there's that journey, which is so important to understand. So once you get the shift in perspective, you stop thinking of them as teenagers going through a phase, and you start to realize it's a human that has been grown differently because the environmental and other, I guess, influences have wired them differently. They don't value, they don't see, they don't communicate in the same way. And so that's why that shift is so critical. And when you look at, like, what does it even mean from a coaching perspective? The next thing is that's the first component, the perspective. And it's a significantly more detail. I have not done it justice at all, trying to unpack it with you now, because there's a lot of research around it and data that supports so much of this. And you start to see kind of the subtleties that help you. The second part is what I call the upskill space. And so in the upskill space, you realize that this year, in 65% of the kids in America entering 6th grade, right? 65% of them, when they graduate, are going to work in jobs that don't yet exist. So how do you prepare this human for a few years down the line where the data shows 65% of them are going to work in jobs? We don't even know what those jobs are yet. Okay, take a step back and think about it this way. 42% of the world population is under the age of 25, which is kind of the Gen Z mark currently, around 25, 26. 52% of the world population is under the age of 30. And so you look at 25 to 30 is that bridging kind of time where there's a lot that they have in common, but yet they don't. We're talking about 52% of the world population is not blue, right? And we're wondering why. And so when you look at this upskill space, which is the second component, so it goes kind of perspective, then it goes upskill, then it goes narrative. Those are the 3 kind of training areas I focus on. And so what we do in the upskill space is kind of what's in it for me, because we've got a generation that has grown up CEOs of their own lives. You know, what do you want? When do you want it? How do you want it? And everything is kind of self, right? And so there's some significant spiritual giants. So in the secular space, obviously, I don't unpack that, but and self is one of them, right? There's no identity. They're a fatherless generation. There's actually data to prove that as well. And then you've got this fear-based kind of mindset, and it's all about self, right? So when you look at all these things, and I'm not doing a good job of unpacking that, you find them in the space where upskill is key. How can I be better on what, and again, tons of data. So what comes with that whole upskill journey is the conversation.
This is the upskill of the coach. This is the upskill of the coach.
No, this is the upskill of the human.
Of the human, the Gen Z.
Right. So in other words, and let me explain to you. The next section that it leads into is SOS versus GPS. So SOS, the story of the Titanic is compelling. They actually had SOS. They had the SOS Morse code technology on the Titanic, and they chose not to use it. They used an older technology, and the ship sank. A joke, in jest, the person said, we might as well send out an SOS message, which was the one that was received, and it might be the last message we ever send, and it was too late to get there in time. So it's a joke. But SOS stands for, it obviously means crisis, right? But in this context, it means sage on stage. And it also stands for a coach. And in this context, it would also stand for something like a carpenter, right? So you've got a mindset that comes out of, listen to this, the second industrial revolution, where we need people to function in this way. And we built an entire globe around producing humans that behaved like that to fulfill the needs we had in the second industrial revolution. We're currently in the fourth industrial revolution, but we still have that sage on stage mindset, do what I tell you, when I tell you, and how I tell you. Okay, so I'll spend a second on that. There is value to being a coach. A coach says, take this ball and throw it in that hoop. Take this and kick it in that goal, right? The house is on fire, run out of this door, right? So there's a space for a coach. That's my definition of coach. Okay, this is not a okay. And another way of looking at it is kind of a carpenter. Take a piece of wood and you make it into a bench. The wood didn't decide what it was going to become; it became a bench. And the timeline on coach is really short. So what I'm saying is that for this generation, there has to be a shift from this amount of coach to this amount of coach, and the balance of it has to be GPS. And what I mean by GPS is the GPS every day. I put it in my phone and I say, take me to work. And the GPS knows what I want and helps me get there, right? So it's a mentor, right? That's the premise of mentoring, coming. And GPS stands for guide positioned by the side. So that's the biggest shift. And when you're a guide positioned by the side, you're a gardener, you plant the seed and you nurture the seed and it becomes what it was always supposed to be. So that's the broad framework. But here's the difference, and why it's so compelling and important, is that Gen Z are almost entirely mentored by their peers. Now, we always like our peer influence. Yes, peer influence has always been a big deal, but it's never been almost entirely at the exclusion of the previous generation, right? So when that lands, it's like, wait, what? So you have a 14-year-old telling a 14-year-old what is acceptable and how to do it. Now, it's always happened to some degree, but never at this scale and never globally. So what this means is that the blue people have zero permission, which is something we unpack in great detail, to speak into any younger generation's life. And understanding that whole permission switch is what this is based on, right? So it's one thing to have legacy knowledge, which all the blue generation has, but the green generation, Gen Z, aren't interested in your legacy knowledge. Why? Because I have access to all information you have. Why do I need you, sage on stage, to tell me? I will do it myself. In fact, I'm going to fact check you while you're talking, and I'll do it my way, right? So I'll take a breath in a second. Do you need? So what permission is based on is this. There are a whole lot of things that lead to permission, but permission is based on upskill, right? So what's in it for me? If you think about Philip in the desert, the eunuch, I'll send you, I did a teaching on this recently at a church. I was going to say it was great. Then I'm like, that's so rude. How would you just say that?
Keep going.
There's a whole unpacking of Philip getting into the desert. He meets the eunuch, but what in that interaction with the eunuch was amazing, because first what happens is the eunuch determines that Philip has something that he wants, right? Teach me, tell me, how can I know unless you tell me? Then he invites Philip up into the carriage. That's permission. So before Gen Z are going to allow you to say anything in their life, they want to know that you've got something of value for them, And it has to stay valuable. Otherwise, like anybody that I follow on Instagram, if I don't want them anymore, I just don't follow. So you have to have value. Then you have to have permission. You have to qualify, even with your own children, which is a mind shift for most parents. And then you get to pour into their lives. And that whole journey is around upskilling, growing them. So when I help companies a lot figure out how to do mentoring programs. Most people in your space will know this, but most professionals aren't being coached or mentored themselves, but they're ready to coach and mentor the younger people. And so I just had a call this week for a company out of North Carolina, and I'm like, so please help us set up a mentoring program. I'm like, no problem. Short version, let's get you guys to be mentored first. And they're like, wait, what? And I'm like, yeah. And I show them the data around what that means for their personal growth. And only once you understand that, can you then start to speak into other kids' lives. Last thing I want to say to you is this, actually two bundles of information. Muscles that are weak in this generation: perseverance, problem solving, communication, and gratitude. When you unpack that and you see that those are weak muscles that they haven't had a chance to build, you understand why they behave like they do and where you need to kind of come in and help them. And we do it in what we call an invisible curriculum. So when it's kind of like, I just spoke to a parent, okay, and he says to me, how can I be more intentional with my child? I'd spend this time with them, this time with this. So I said, I explained to them problem solving is one of them, or one of the areas. And he's like, okay, so we're brainstorming what to do about that. I said, how about this? Take 2 envelopes with money in, hide them in the house, and then sit them down one night when you're doing dinner where your wife's not there, and you say, right, tonight, in order for us to eat, we have to find the money. It's somewhere in this house. If you find that money, we'll go and get whatever we're going to get. But if you don't find that money, we will not eat today. And so the premise of that is starting to teach them how to problem solve, right? Without saying, go and hunt for your food. So those 4 muscles are really weak, and we do it in an invisible way as we address it. And then the last thing I'm going to say to you, then I'll give you carte blanche to say whatever you need, is that you've also got to understand that with this perfect storm, 4 things are going on. There's lots of 4s here. We've moved from access over ownership. So we've moved into a space of accessing versus ownership. So we access anything we want on demand, pay a subscription, but we own nothing. That changes your mindset. I'm interested in doing this until I'm not, right? So you have to understand that mindset if you're truly going to coach these people, walk with them, grow them, upskill them in any way. That mindset is so common. All of us are green here, right? I watched Liverpool. I was somewhere, I couldn't see Liverpool for whatever on the stream that I was out of the country, and I signed up for a thing, watched Liverpool, unsubscribed, right? Liverpool's my team. So access over ownership is one thing that's changed. The second thing that's changed is the awareness over action. So you've got a generation that are aware of everything, primarily because of this. And what does that awareness lead to? It leads to judgment. Oh, well, you shouldn't do this. You should say this. You should wear this. But there's very little action that comes with it. And that's just part of an evolution. Alpha generation are going to actually take action about some of these things. But it's still early in that cycle. But what we have is we have a lot of people talking, saying, judging, having opinions, but not really doing anything with that. And you've got to understand that in the workplace. Then we've got 2 more. Fear over faith. All our decisions are based on fear. Decisions aren't made out of faith. And this faith isn't just faith in God. It's faith in your boss. It's faith in the system. It's faith in, there's a whole lot of faith components, but we're generally making decisions based out of fear. So the first thing I told you was technology, world news. World news, there's a thing called mean world syndrome. It's a cognitive bias that was studied in the 70s. And in essence, what it says is we're going to die. Don't you dare go outside, be petrified, be scared. But yet we're living in, and data proves it, the safest, healthiest, wealthiest time in recorded human history. But we feel like we're going to die any minute. And world news does that. It presents the world in such a way you're like, oh, well, that puts fuel on this making decisions based out of fear. What happens if I don't? What happens if I do? So again, from a coaching perspective, it's important. And then the last thing is we have an abundance of information, but very little understanding. So this, again, gives you access to all knowledge, but it doesn't truly give you understanding. So why is that important to understand all those different components? Is because for any older generation, mentor, business leader, if you want to be in business in a few years' time, if you don't figure out how to get through that, it's called have you heard about the 8-second attention span that this generation second? Well, it's wrong. Okay, it's called an 8-second filter. And I've told Deloitte and Ernest Young both come up with that 8-second filter, attention span. But really what it is a filter. There's so much data that you become really good at, and we're all green in this space, believe it or not. We become really, really good at saying, I can process this, I can't process this. So the point is, you've got to get through this 8-second filter in order to be able to be given permission to influence people positively in their lives. So if you don't understand those basic concepts, it's always just like, this generation or this person. But there really is an entire methodology around understanding why they are wired like they are. And when you understand how they're wired, the fruit that we've been able to see in terms of just changing that mindset, that perspective, perception a little bit is mind-boggling. And a bunch of people are doing a good job in this space. So I'm going to take a breath. Did that make sense?
I absolutely love that. This is unrehearsed. I'm just going to think aloud. I'm thinking in the elite coaching place, and I'm purposely going to move away from the South African context. And Steve, I've just been held in awe what the Belgians have done in field hockey in the last decade. We played them, South Africa played them a decade ago. We were both all sitting around 10 and 12 in the world. They have been the kings of men's hockey for the last 4 years. They're Olympic champions and things. Their women are sitting at about number 5. There are some South Africans in the coaching program there. I've just put an online field hockey coaches program together with the hockey site, which is based in Belgium. And when I was talking to one of their coaches who's working on the team development, they have allocated the most extraordinary amount of resource to the sort of 14-year-olds right now. And if you talk to them, they talk about this team is likely to play in the 2028 Olympics. So they're even beyond Paris right now, and even talking about Brisbane for 32. I guess where I'm going with that is, what happens to permission when you've got an emerging elite athlete who has resonance? Let's take it's a teenage boy right now. So he has resonance with the national team right now of Belgium because they are the kings of the world right now. And he actually wants to reach to this generation. So has he given them more permission already? Because I want your skills, I want your mindset. And is he sharp enough with this filter to say, I'll couple that with mine? So is there an extra reach over that line? Because, and with the World Cup soccer at the moment, I'm sure some young Argentinians would reach over that line to Messi right now. So where is there so much love and respect in elite sport because they are adulated to reach over the line to the coach, where some other professions you won't reach over the line?
So that's a really good point. So the premise of parents having permission, coaches having permission, leaders having permission to speak into their subjects, for want of better terms, lives, it comes with a caveat. And so what that is, you've touched on a little bit, based on the nature of the relationship, you have, I'm not a gambling man, but you come to the table with certain chips, right? So because you're the coach of a national team, are you going to have influence over people and permission? Are you going to have a stack of chips to begin that conversation? 100% yes. Now, you can go through history and you can look at all these incredible coaches, and some of them you've mentioned today, but you can also grow a list that is 10 times longer than of coaches that have been destructive, destroyed, and not been good at all, right? Okay, so there's that clear thing, right? Here's the reality of it. The best time to plant a tree, an old proverb, is 20 years ago. The second best time to plant a tree is today, okay? So what am I saying to you is this. You can have results today, but if you expect those results to be meaningful and ongoing, fundamentally, something has to shift. Because that reach over the line that you just mentioned, you've already seen how it shifted in the Dutch ladies hockey.
Yeah.
So what I'm telling you is 52% of the world's population is Gen Z and Alpha, under the age of 30. I'm also telling you they're wired differently. And just because coaches had that power and that say, not necessarily badly, right? That influence, it doesn't mean they will continue to have that. And there's going to have to be an upskill component for me to be part of it. So, bad example, Gen Z likes coffee. They're going to drink from A or B, both of them are the same. Well, until one of them is different, you'll very quickly see. So I said that poorly. Let me say that again. If A is, this is where the beans come from, this is how, and this coffee is made in this way versus in this way, Gen Z will decide and one of those brands will die, because Gen Z is a significant player in the world economy, significant. Okay. So I'm saying to you that you will have Denmark and a coach in Denmark who's doing incredibly well. But if that foundation isn't truly looking at how this generation is wired, and if there isn't truly just an upskill, it's just a matter of time until that thing falls apart. So you can have a short version, a short season of success because of that accolade. But what will happen is the farming system will die, because at the end of the day, when you look at a guy like Maradona who commits suicide, I don't know, he didn't, right? He was, did he?
I think overdose or something. Yeah, I think
Okay, doesn't matter.
yeah. Didn't have a happy end. Yeah.
When people get to a point in their lives, especially on sports that are relatively short-lived, you'll see very, very quickly, like, is that really what this is about? And they'll also look at the journey that they've had to go through to be that. So in other words, I'm saying to you, to be a Navy SEAL, you don't have to be actually punched in the face. Some sergeants might have punched you in the face, and it's part of growing up, but there are other ways, probably significantly more effective. And so all I'm saying is this, is that at the end of the day, you look at what bears fruit. And probably the hardest place to see that is at the top part of the echelon, because you've got that draw that brings people there. But what you'll start to see over a period of time is, if you didn't plant the tree well, is that at some point you'll have no trees. People will start to move away from that, because what the perceived journey is doesn't check all the boxes of who I am as a human. And we are moving in that direction significantly. And I think we should be. And most coaches and mentors have always had that mindset. So I don't know if that answered your question. It's such a complicated question to answer. My point is, if you don't make sure that your process is truly a process that's invested in growing the people, not focused only on outcome, which is hard in that space. I'm telling you, it's not going to live very long.
Brilliant, Steve. And I fully appreciate that we're just touching the tip of the iceberg. Maybe one last question, and I might take a while to try and articulate this clearly. With reaching across the line, even when Roger and when I met you for the first time, I've been over at the National Center of Fathering. And so I guess I'm going for the authentic deposit, generational transfer that needs to take place. And if we're saying that Gen Z have really parented themselves, have mothered and fathered themselves.
Correct.
Are we able, through sport, to put this invisible structure in place where they might not even know it, but they are tasting authentic parenting through sports coaching, because it gives us a contact point? And I'm not trying to be patriarchal here or linking towards the male, but I think we have done more damage in this space than the average woman on the planet right now. But is there an invisible something that we can bring into our coaching that every generation will resonate with, even because it's a cry of the human heart to have that deposit?
Wow. So it didn't take you long to articulate that, and I think you articulated it really well. I mean, that's the point, right? That's the whole point. First and foremost, there's been a epidemic of undermanagement in the home and in industry. I mean, that's a documented point, which means they've grown up autonomously, guiding and so on. And so what has always worked, and what we're needing to get back to, is truly the one-on-one. What does this plant need? What does this plant need? Right. This one needs sun, this one needs shade. Right. But we've moved so far from that. I have a system, fit into my system, and if you don't, there's somebody on the bench who's going to take your place. That's the SOS coach mindset, broadly speaking. Now, I'm not talking about growing the individual. I'm talking about putting a team on the field. If you don't step up, so-and-so is waiting to take your place. And that kind of regimented mindset, while it's practical and works and it's actually functional, is truly not, I believe, going to position us well. So what you're suggesting, is 100% where I believe our heads need to be. There is an invisible curriculum. It's critical that you put it in place. Partly why? Because that invisible curriculum bypasses the 8-second filter. That's the main reason. But the other thing is that it starts to teach you skills that are going to surpass the current moment that you're in. It's not just about hockey. It's about teaching you to be a human. And that whole identity is what this is about. We're talking about helping people understand their identity. And identity is based on a number of things. What's critical in the identity journey is dopamine. And what gives us dopamine is doing hard things. And that dopamine fix, we are wired to do hard things, to be challenged on an ongoing basis. This gives us a dopamine fix. And unfortunately, this is part of the reason identity is being challenged so much. Now, I'm not talking about sexual identity. I'm talking about your identity as a person and your peace with who you are, right? Failing, succeeding, all those things. That journey of true identity, knowing who you are and striving to be the best you can, the way that you get someone to journey on that journey, we can look at history and see coaches that have done that incredibly well, and you can see coaches that have failed. If we don't make the norm coaches who do that really well, not only focused on the outcome, but focused on the human in that journey, that will ultimately be what is the critical issue. And so what you have to, so when I'm working with you, the time I've taken to understand and get to know you automatically gives me a chance to focus on certain areas, which will be very different when I focus on Steve Robertson, right? Mm. And that's what this means, that stop for the one who's in front of you, lead them, grow them well, and they'll grow at different paces. And what is amazing is you're doing this while they're playing hockey, right? So your motive is hockey, but your motive is significantly bigger than hockey. Mm. That is the solution. I can give you a bunch of different examples in business, how we have to think that through and make that happen. And ultimately what ends up happening is that you establish within a team like that or within a business like that, you establish a culture that starts to manage itself. Cultures don't happen by themselves. They have to be grown and tended. If you leave culture to itself, it ends up being negative, cooler talk culture. So what you do in this journey is you start to create a culture, and that culture is around winning is really important, but you are much more important. And in fact, right? And so really easy to say when the coach's job is on the line, right? Really easy to say. And that's why this is such a tough journey. And that's why you started when they're 5 and not when they're about to get into the Springbok team. Because at that point, it's really hard to focus on these things. But if you're working with those people, the authenticity, which you alluded to, is the key. Everybody knows instinctively, intuitively, whether this is motivated out of selfish greed, agenda, and or if there's an authentic desire to see who you are and help you be a better version of yourself. And so the concept of coaching versus mentoring has got not to do with kind of the on-court tactical things. That's why I said there's a space for coaching in every one of our lives. Very, very tactical. Take this and do this. This is how you can do it better. Do this, do this. But if it isn't partnered very heavily with this mentor mindset, like who are you? Let me understand you without getting into your personal life, right? You've got to can't cross those boundaries either, right? Because that's a dangerous space. Yeah. But with a motive of how am I going to upskill this person? It's your best example. Karate Kid, Mr. Miyagi, Daniel's son. Wax on, wax off. He's learning a skill without knowing. It's a great, great, great example of somebody who's seeing a vision of what I'm going to do in this person. And once they get it, they will look back and not even realize that they've learned it, but they'll be better for it. Because ultimately, I'm preparing them for 2028. I'm preparing them for 2030 when the jobs that exist right now don't even exist. Right. So it's got to be significantly greater. And especially in sport, one broken leg, bone, arm, and you can never play again. Right. And what are you going to just let them walk off into the sunset? Yeah, that's what we do. I can't use you anymore. Good luck. Nice knowing you. Right. Mm. So the authentic relationship component. And it's not so much even about relationship. It's about motive. If the motives are truly authentic, everybody's aware of it. And I think that's where we need to go. We have to examine our motives. We have to examine how we want to try and engage with people. And I think there's a transition period, like with anything, right? When we go to, my daughter's got a Tesla, when you move to this autonomous car driving process, sometimes you do it, sometimes you don't. Most people don't do it. There'll be a time where everybody does it. And in the same way here, we're moving from this SOS mindset to a GPS mindset. There's going to be a transitional time. And in the in-between time, things are messy. So it's like, you can't be all mentor, you can't be all coach, but you've got to be coach, but you've got to be mentor. Like, how do you figure out that nuance, those nuances? Well, each person has to go on that journey, right? And every environment is going to require it to look and feel a little bit different. But you've got to, that's why the perspective is so important, because once you have the perspective, you're a little bit more aware of the different approaches and the impact that they could have, and you're just a little bit more informed from that perspective, right? So your decision is now made out of a slightly different position. And that is really what the key is. If you just have the understanding, you can problem solve. Any good coach, any good leader will start to think about, now that I know that, how's that going to influence my day-to-day? How's that going to influence my communication and my engagement and my interaction? Is there another way? And as soon as you dive into that, the fruit becomes evident really quickly. So in other words, you try something different and all of a sudden you see it's bearing fruit and you're like, whoa, who knew? Okay. And that's how you stumble. That's progress, right? That's how you stumble on progress. You're innovating. And I'm saying to you, you have to, otherwise you're not going to see the same fruit. As he takes a breath.
Thanks. You could switch off the recording there. Thanks. And I've chatted to you. Oh, Steve, that was so inspiring.